The Holy Gospel of our Savior, Jesus Christ, according to Mark. Glory to you, Lord Christ. Jesus and his disciples went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. And they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of the one holy and undivided Trinity, amen. You gave me such wonderful feedback last Sunday about hearing stories from my ministry with refugees about 20 years ago. So I'm going to tell more stories this week. You got to be careful because I've got lots of stories to tell, so don't encourage me too much. But I thought, especially since refugees are in the news, and especially since we have this story today about Jesus bringing a child into the center of a conversation, to remind us that discipleship is welcoming a child, I thought maybe today might be a good day to share more stories. So I mentioned last week that when I was working with refugees and refugee resettlement in Atlanta, that one of the groups that we worked with were the Lost Boys. This group of Sudanese who had escaped and been separated from their families. They had made their way to Kenya and had grown up in a refugee camp in Kenya, and then in their 20s were resettled, early 20s, were resettled in the United States. And some of them came to the Atlanta area where I was working at the time. And one of the guys that came was Abraham Nial, who now is Bishop Abraham Nial of South Sudan. But when he came to Atlanta, he was a 21 or so year old deacon of the Anglican Church of Sudan. He had been ordained because of his leadership in the refugee camp in Kenya. So when he came to Atlanta, one of the first things he wanted to do was to start a worshiping congregation. And so I helped him start this worshiping congregation in Clarkston, which is a little community outside of Atlanta where many of the refugees were living at the time. And there weren't just Lost Boys there. There were also some Sudanese families who had young children. So I wasn't ordained at the time, and I couldn't speak Dinka, so I thought what I'll do is I'll do a Sunday school class for the kids while their parents worship with Abraham and a priest that the diocese sent us. So I started this little Sunday school class. I got some volunteers to help me, and we had a Sunday school class of about 15 to 20 little kids. And they were so adorable, and you could tell that they watched a lot of PBS children's programs. Because whenever I introduced myself as Elizabeth, they would immediately start calling me Emily Elizabeth. Does anybody know who Emily Elizabeth is? Yeah, we have a couple people here who know who Emily Elizabeth is. That's Clifford the big red dog's best friend, Emily Elizabeth. So I became known as Emily Elizabeth, which is so funny because it's so much harder to say than just Elizabeth, which is hard enough. But anyway, that's what they called me, Emily Elizabeth. So one time I was teaching them a lesson. I think we were getting ready for Easter, and so I was talking about Jesus' work of salvation on the cross. And so I started the conversation by asking these children, have you ever done anything difficult? Now, remember, they had recently arrived in the United States. Their families, unlike the Lost Boys, most of them had gone to escape Sudan and gone to Cairo in Egypt. And so instead of living in a refugee camp, they had lived in an urban area and had had a very difficult time surviving in this urban area until they were resettled. And so these kids had seen a lot in their short lives. But when I asked them, have you ever done anything difficult or hard, one by one they started telling me, my mom makes me sweep the floor, and my mom makes me do the dishes. And it was just so hilarious, because kids are so resilient. They're so in the moment. It doesn't matter what they suffered yesterday. It's like their pain is what they're suffering today. And it was really very sweet. But at the same time, I don't want you to get a sentimental image of these children. They had very difficult lives, and they responded to those difficult lives, sometimes with great resilience and sometimes with behavior that is not healthy. I remember one little girl, and she was a little striver. So those of us who knew her from All Saints wanted to help her get a really good education. She was probably in 2nd or 3rd grade, but we helped her go to a charter school, an elementary charter school, so that she would get a better education than the one in her neighborhood. And I'll never forget getting a call from one of the administrators at the charter school and telling me that this little girl was crying every day when she had to go home. And when they asked her, why are you crying? She said, because when I go home, I'm all by myself until my mom comes home from work. And I have to lock the door, and I'm scared. And I knew her mom. Her mom was doing the best she could. She had to work. She had to take the only job she could take because of her, she didn't speak English well. She was only supported, refugees are only supported for the first 3 months when they come into the country, and so she very quickly had to find a job and get working. And I remember the stress of that situation, of this unsolvable problem, the needs of the mother, the needs of the child, the desire for the child to have a better education, but that took her away from many of the resources that were closer by, and trying to balance all of those things. So this was 20 years ago, so I don't really remember what the outcome of that story is, but what's in my brain, what I remember is that feeling of stress that I had in encountering this problem. How are we going to figure this one out? And it wasn't even my life. I wasn't the kid. I wasn't the mother. It wasn't even my life. But what I remember is that feeling of stress, how much more stressful it must have been for them to live in that situation, the amount of stress it takes to make it when you don't have the resources you need. So I think it's important when we hear this story of Jesus bringing that child into the center of the story, into the center of the conversation, that we don't imagine our own children, our own grandchildren, or our nieces and nephews, or the little children in our neighborhood, but rather we remember neglected children, that we imagine a poor child being brought into the middle of that story. Children living in the midst of war, refugee children, disabled children, children who act out, whose behavior isn't what we want it to be, children in juvenile detention. We remember those children being brought into the middle of the conversation. because Jesus is not presenting to us a sentimental image of sweet innocence by bringing that child into the middle of the story. Rather, he is wanting to illustrate his teaching that whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. The Greek word that Jesus uses for child here, that Mark uses for child, has two meanings. It can mean your offspring, but it can also mean a slave. So Jesus is bringing into the center of the conversation a person who has little societal worth or value and certainly no power. And within that strict hierarchy of the ancient world, the child was the most subservient human and had the slightest status. So you may have noticed that our gospel lesson today from Mark parallels the gospel lesson that we read last Sunday. Both of them are what we call passion predictions. You remember last Sunday we talked about that Jesus had made the turn towards Jerusalem in his ministry. The first part of his ministry, he was healing and teaching and gathering the disciples together. And then with that first passion prediction, he turns his face towards Jerusalem and he begins his journey to the cross. He begins to tell his disciples what it is that they can expect when they get to Jerusalem. And then this Sunday, they're on their journey to Jerusalem, and again, he predicts for them what awaits them in Jerusalem. And just like in last Sunday's gospel, Jesus' prediction is followed by the disciples' incomprehension of what he is trying to teach them. Last Sunday, remember, Peter says, don't tell them you're going to die, Jesus. That's not good for the movement. Don't tell them that. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. That kind of thinking gets in the way of our ministry. And this Sunday, Mark tells us that when the disciples hear about what's going to happen in Jerusalem, the cross and the resurrection, they just don't understand, and they're too afraid to even ask Jesus what he's talking about. And then you may remember as well that after that, Jesus then calls the disciples and calls all of us into discipleship. And again today, after the disciples don't understand, Jesus then says that discipleship is all about that picking up your cross and following Jesus. It means that the first will be last and the last will be first. And it means welcoming the little powerless children and all of those in our society who are the least of these in Jesus' name. That's what discipleship is all about. So we have in last Sunday and this Sunday's gospel lessons parallel passion predictions and then calls into discipleship. And between these two stories in Mark's gospel are two more passages that our lectionary does not have us read during this time of year. But I think those two passages that are between these two big bookends of the passion predictions are important for us to understand what Jesus is talking about. So the first one is the story of the transfiguration, when Jesus goes up onto the mountain and is transfigured. And the second one is the story of the healing. It's really an exorcism of a boy with a demon. And then most importantly, Jesus' dialogue with the Father afterwards. And so these two episodes that are between the two bookends of the passion prediction have two ways that they help us understand these passion predictions. First, it helps us to see the resonance of this language about the child. And second, it teaches us the kind of faith that discipleship requires. So this first story, Jesus goes up on the mountain. He takes with him Peter, James, and John, 3 of his disciples. He goes up on the mountain with them, and while he's up on the mountain, he begins to glow, and he's transfigured before them, and they see Elijah and Moses are there with them, and then they hear this voice from heaven that says, "This is my son. Listen to him." Jesus too is a child, the Son of God. And so we are reminded when we hear Jesus talking about welcoming the child, that when we welcome the child, we're also welcoming Jesus, who is also a son. After they hear the voice, Jesus, and Mark's gospel just has an incredible pace, so you just have this image of Jesus careening off the mountain. And when he gets down to the bottom of the mountain, he finds the other disciples, the disciples who had been left behind, and they are surrounding a child, and they're trying to cast a demon out of another child, and they can't do it. They try and they try, but they can't do this exorcism. And so the disciples ask Jesus for help. And so Jesus turns to the Father, who's there with his Son, and he says to the Father, or the Father says to him, "If you can, won't you help him?" And Jesus says to the Father, "If I can? Like, do you believe I can do this or not?" And then the man responds with that cry that is all of our cry. "I believe, Lord. Help my unbelief." Holding together what is deep within all of us, a longing to believe in the promises of God, a longing to believe in the truth of the cross and the resurrection, that's held there in tension with all of the ways that we doubt, all of the ways that we fear, all of the ways that we wonder, could this be true? "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." That cry is good enough for Jesus, and he casts the demon out of the child. Then we come to today's gospel, and we have this, which I think is comic relief, the disciples arguing about who is the greatest. Remember, they just failed. They just failed to cast the demon out of the child. And here they are immediately after that trying to figure out, well, who's better? Who failed worse, I guess. I don't know. Who failed better? I don't know what it is. But they're arguing about who is the greatest. And Jesus reminds them, no, this is not what discipleship is about. Not about figuring out who is the greatest, but it's about embracing that ambiguity of faith. To be able to claim, "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief," that cry is what gives us the strength and the courage to embrace the vulnerable in our world, no matter how hard it is to do and how many doubts we might bring to the task. That discipleship requires that we hold tightly to the promise that the cross does lead to resurrection. That resurrection, which is the recapitulation of all of those mountaintop moments of our lives, all of those moments when we are with the disciples on the top of the mountain and we see the reality of who Jesus is. That's what discipleship is. To remember that we descend from the mountain into the hard places of life so that we may find life. And know that life exists both on the mountaintop and in the valley. But let's face it, it is hard to believe. When we look around the world, it is hard to believe that the first will be last and the last will be first. We look around and what I see is people who are blessed just getting more blessed and people who are struggling just struggling more. It's sometimes so hard to believe in that promise that Jesus gives us. I'm sure we all can think about examples of when the tables turned and somebody got their comeuppance. But the reality is that most people, like my refugee friends, are just trying to slog through this life, trying to make it all fit together. And even those of us with plenty experience hardship and have to find ways to move through loss and death and quarantine and on and on. And here is where we hold tight to that promise that I believe, Lord, help my unbelief is good enough. The disciples wanted to avoid the teaching that Jesus needed them to hear, and they got lost in that pitiful debate of who is the greatest. But Jesus invites them, and Jesus invites us into another direction. Follow him. Bring your doubts and all, and act in faith that the cross does lead to resurrection, and that welcoming the child is welcoming Jesus and is being welcomed by Jesus. So I'm going to close with one more spectacular memory from my refugee ministry days with the Sudanese children. And I think this was a mountaintop experience for me, and something I treasure and hold on to still. We took a field trip one Sunday afternoon to the Etowah Indian Mounds, which are in Cartersville, Georgia, north of Atlanta. Anybody been to the Etowah Indian Mounds? So these are Indian mounds that are out in the country. They were built about 1,500 years ago by the Native Americans who lived in that area at the time. And at least 20 years ago, there weren't a lot of people who visited. So it's just this beautiful park. It's a state park, and there's just fields and lots of green space, and it was really beautiful. So it was about 10 kids went with us, and there was another volunteer from All Saints who went with us, and then we borrowed a van from another ministry that All Saints partnered with, and it was a recovery program for people recovering from alcohol and drug addiction. And so we hired a driver from that program to drive us, African-American man who was an alumni from that program, and just a very dear man, and he hung out with us all day. So there we were, a descendant of an American enslaved person, 10 little survivors of war in Sudan, and the 2 volunteers from All Saints. And we were all just totally running around and having a great time on this historic site from the native people of this land. And I thought, this is America, people. This is awesome. It was a beautiful day, and the kids loved it. They loved it especially because the Indian Mounds were located right next to a field where cows were grazing. And I don't know if you know this, but Dinka people find cows sacred. So these kids had grown up in Cairo, mostly in Cairo, and then had come to the U.S. They hadn't seen cows, but they'd heard about cows. So they were so excited to see these cows next to the Indian Mounds. And it was just a beautiful day, and I treasure that day, and I remember it as Jesus welcoming me, his child, welcoming me into God's eternity here in this life, and Jesus calling me as his disciple. The first will be last, and the last will be first. Thanks be to God.